You hear a 20-something say they can't come in today. Burnout. Overwhelmed. Needs a mental health day. You say the right thing. You nod. You tell them it's fine. But inside, something tightens. A quiet voice says, "That's not a reason. You grew up differently. You rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Nobody asked if you were okay. You figured it out. You fell. You bled. You kept going. Not because someone taught you resilience, because nobody was watching closely enough to stop you from struggling. Now you're in a world where struggle itself is treated like damage, and you don't know whether to admire the new sensitivity or lose your mind at it. Here's what's actually happening inside your brain, and theirs. The gap between you isn't a values gap. It's not laziness versus grit. It's neurology, built in childhood, largely permanent. Your brain learned what stress means before you could spell the word. Here's how. Every time you faced discomfort as a child, a scraped knee, a boring afternoon, a problem nobody helped you solve, your brain released cortisol, the stress hormone. And each time you survived that discomfort, your brain logged it. That wasn't fatal, noted. Over time, your anterior cingulate cortex, the region that processes frustration, conflict, and physical pain, built up what neuroscientists call a stress threshold. Think of it like a callus. The more friction, the thicker the skin. Researcher Michael Meany at McGill University spent decades studying how early life stress exposure shapes the brain's glucocorticoid receptors, the docking stations for cortisol. His findings were stark. Children exposed to moderate, manageable stress early in life developed more receptors. More receptors means better regulation. The stress hits, gets processed, and clears faster. Your 70s-era nervous system isn't impatient, it's calibrated. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. That calibration happened without your consent. You didn't choose the environment that built your threshold. It was handed to you by circumstance, by parents who were busy, by neighborhoods that were unsupervised, by a culture that hadn't yet decided children needed protecting from difficulty. You didn't earn your toughness through discipline. You absorbed it through exposure. That distinction matters more than most 70s kids ever stopped to consider. The 70s weren't trying to raise tough kids. They just weren't trying that hard at all. That sounds harsh. It isn't. It's evolutionary context. For virtually all of human history, children were raised by a village, then largely ignored by it. They roamed, they fought, they got hungry and waited, they got bored and invented something to do. The developmental term for this is free-range childhood, and it wasn't a parenting philosophy in the 70s. It was just Tuesday. Psychologist Peter Gray at Boston College has spent his career documenting what happens when children direct their own play without adult intervention. His research shows that self-directed play is the primary mechanism through which children develop frustration tolerance, conflict resolution, and emotional regulation. Not therapy, not structured activities. Unsupervised chaos with neighborhood kids until someone's mom yelled from a porch. That was your childhood. The evolutionary logic is clean. A nervous system that panics at every obstacle dies on the savannah. So nature built children to calibrate their threat response against their actual environment. Your environment said, discomfort is normal, help is delayed, figure it out. Your brain believed it. Then something shifted. By the 90s, average childhood autonomy collapsed. Traffic fears, stranger danger headlines, liability culture. Children moved indoors, onto schedules, under supervision. The accidental stress inoculation lab shut down right as the next generation was lining up to enter it. The environment changed. The nervous system didn't get the memo. Opinions about generational weakness are everywhere. Actual data is rarer. Here's what the research shows. Start with Walter Mischel's marshmallow studies. Everyone knows the original: a child, a marshmallow, a promise of 2 if they wait. What gets cited less is the decades of follow-up research. Children who delayed gratification at age 4 showed measurably better stress regulation, higher frustration tolerance, and stronger executive function into their 40s. Delayed gratification wasn't just a personality trait. It was a predictor of a fundamentally different nervous system. Then look at Jean Twenge's generational dataset. Twenge, a psychologist at San Diego State University, tracked self-reported anxiety, depression, and psychological distress across American generations using data spanning 5 decades. Her findings, published in iGen, showed that psychological distress among teenagers began rising sharply around 2012. Not gradually, sharply. The same year, smartphone penetration crossed 50%. But here's the number that stops people cold. A 2018 American Psychological Association survey found that Gen Z reported the worst mental health of any living generation. 73% said loneliness was a significant source of stress. Among baby boomers and Gen X, 50%. Now the uncomfortable part. A 2019 study in child development by Lucy Boreham found that overprotective parenting, the kind that removes struggle before a child can metabolize it, produced adults with significantly lower distress tolerance and higher rates of anxiety disorders. The protection meant to prevent damage caused different damage. You survive things people now go to therapy to process. That's real. That's earned. But survival isn't the same as health. Here's what the research quietly reveals about the generation that never complained. A 2017 study published in the Journal of Men's Health found that adults who experienced high childhood adversity without emotional support, not trauma, just ordinary unprocessed hardship, showed significantly elevated rates of alexithymia, the clinical term for not being able to identify or describe your own emotions. You didn't learn to feel your feelings. You learned to outrun them. Psychologist Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, spent decades documenting what happens to stress that never gets verbally processed. It doesn't disappear. It relocates into the body, into short fuses, into a particular contempt for people who struggle openly with things you struggled with silently. That tightening in your jaw when someone calls in burned out, that's not moral superiority. That's projection. A nervous system that was never allowed to name its own exhaustion, recognizing exhaustion in someone else and rejecting it. Because if their struggle is valid, what does that make yours? The toughness that carried you through decades has a shadow. Difficulty asking for help, dismissing real mental illness as weakness, quietly white-knuckling through things that deserve actual attention. The generation that was never allowed to be fragile produced some of the most capable people alive. It also produced some of the loneliest. Strength and suppression grew from the same soil. You don't need to become soft. You need to become precise. There's a difference between earned toughness and reflexive dismissal. The goal isn't to start validating every excuse. It's to stop confusing your calibration for the universal standard. Your nervous system was built in a specific lab. Not everyone attended that lab. That's not a character flaw. It's developmental history. Here's how to work with what you have. First, name the trigger. When someone's struggle irritates you, pause before reacting. Ask, is this person actually weak, or are they just struggling loudly in a way I was never permitted to? That 1 second of friction changes the response entirely. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's research on the somatic marker hypothesis shows that labeling an emotional trigger reduces its automatic grip on behavior. Naming it literally dampens the amygdala response. Second, audit your own threshold. Once a week, ask yourself one question. What am I currently white-knuckling through that deserves actual attention? Not to complain, just to inventory. Psychologist James Pennebaker at the University of Texas found that brief written emotional disclosure, even 3 minutes, measurably reduced cortisol levels and improved immune function in adults who historically suppressed stress. Third, separate observation from judgment. You can notice that someone has lower distress tolerance than you without deciding they are lesser. Different nervous system, different childhood lab, different calibration. Your resilience is real. It carried you through decades of things that would floor other people. But a tool that can't tell the difference between an obstacle and a person will eventually cause damage. Keep the toughness. Lose the contempt. That's not weakness. That's precision.